Travis James Mollis was executed by lethal injection in Texas on September 24, 2024, for the 2008 murder of his 3-month-old son, Elijah Mollis. On January 29, 2008, Travis James Mollis, then 21, drove his 3-month-old son, Elijah, to a secluded area on the Galveston seawall after an argument with his girlfriend. In a horrific act, Mollis essayed Elijah. When the infant began to cry uncontrollably, Mollis proceeded to strangle him and then stomped on his head multiple times, crushing his skull. After killing Elijah, Mollis disposed of the baby's body by throwing it into roadside brush. Elijah's body was discovered later by a passerby. Mollis then fled Texas, traveling for 3 days before surrendering to police in Philadelphia. He confessed to the murder in a written statement and a videotaped interview. Mollis had a deeply troubled background marked by abandonment and severe childhood abuse. His biological father left shortly after his birth, and his mother died when he was 10 months old. He was adopted by his uncle and aunt, but his adoptive father SA'd him for 3 years, leading to the adoptive father's conviction and incarceration. From a young age, Mollis received extensive psychiatric treatment for various psychological issues, impulse control disorder, PTSD, and bipolar disorder. He reported experiencing flashbacks of his childhood SA. Mollis also had a history of molesting young children, and at 13, he was sent to a school for emotionally troubled juveniles after SAing an 8-year-old cousin. In March 2011, a jury in Galveston County convicted Travis James Mollis of capital murder, specifically for intentionally causing the death of an individual under 6 years of age. He was subsequently sentenced to death. Throughout his time on death row, Mollis had a contentious relationship with his attorneys, often wavering on whether to pursue appeals. At various points, he explicitly waived his right to appeal, stating that he accepted responsibility and that justice is deserved for the victims' families. His attorneys, however, argued that his long history of profound mental illness rendered him incompetent to waive his appeals. Despite their efforts, including claims of deficient representation and the presentation of false evidence at trial, federal courts ultimately upheld the rulings that Mollis had competently chosen to waive further review of his death sentence. Travis James Mollis, 38, was executed by lethal injection at the Texas State Penitentiary in Huntsville on September 24, 2024. The execution was delayed by approximately 20 minutes as technicians worked to find a suitable vein, eventually inserting a second needle in his left foot. In his final statement, Mollis apologized to his son's mother and her family, expressing regret for taking his son's life and stating that he did not regret his decision to expedite the execution process. He also remarked that he was not the same man he was when he committed the crime and believed in rehabilitation. He was pronounced dead at 7:01 p.m. His execution marked the fourth by the state of Texas in 2024. Kevin Ray Underwood was an American convicted murderer from Purcell, Oklahoma, who was executed by lethal injection on December 19, 2024, his 45th birthday, for the 2006 murder of 10-year-old Jamie Rose Bolin. On April 12, 2006, Underwood, a neighbor of Jamie Rose Bolin, lured her into his apartment under the guise of playing with a pet rat. He then attacked her, hitting her several times with a wooden cutting board before suffocating her. Underwood confessed that he had planned for months to carry out sexual and cannibalistic fantasies, choosing Bolin as a convenient victim. After the murder, he attempted to essay her and then tried to decapitate her in the bathtub, but was unsuccessful. He wrapped her body in plastic sheeting, placed it in a container in his closet, and dismantled her bicycle to make it appear as though she had left the apartment complex. Jamie's body was found 2 days later after police identified Underwood as a suspect and obtained his consent to search his apartment. He confessed to the crime, stating, "Go ahead and arrest me. She's in there. I hit her and chopped her up." An autopsy showed her throat had been cut from ear to ear, but her body was otherwise intact, and the cause of death was likely lack of oxygen. On February 29, 2008, a jury found Underwood guilty of first-degree murder after deliberating for just 23 minutes, largely influenced by his videotaped confession. On March 7, 2008, the jury recommended the death penalty, which was approved by McLean County District Judge Candace Blaylock on April 3, 2008. Underwood and his legal team pursued numerous appeals, arguing that his death sentence was unconstitutional due to a history of abuse and serious mental health issues, including autism, obsessive-compulsive disorder, bipolar and panic disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, and schizotypal personality disorder. Despite these arguments and a tearful statement from his mother at a clemency hearing, the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board voted 3-0 against recommending clemency on December 13, 2024. Prosecutors countered that his crime was one of the most notorious and depraved murders in Oklahoma history, and that his deviance was rooted in sexual desires rather than mental illness that would mitigate culpability. Kevin Ray Underwood was executed by lethal injection at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester on December 19, 2024. He was pronounced dead at 10:14 a.m. His execution was the 25th and final in the U.S. for 2024, and Oklahoma's fourth that year. In his final statement, Underwood apologized to Jamie's family and his own, stating, "The decision to execute me on my birthday and 6 days before Christmas was a needlessly cruel thing to do to my family, but I'm very sorry for what I did, and I wish I could take it back." He was reportedly crying silently as the execution began. Jamie Boland's sister, Lori Pate, witnessed the execution and expressed gratitude to prosecutors, stating that it allowed her family the space in our hearts to focus on her and allow the healing process to begin. Richard Norman Rojam Jr. was an American convicted murderer executed by lethal injection in Oklahoma on June 27, 2024, for the 1984 kidnapping and murder of his 7-year-old former stepdaughter, Layla Cummings. Rojam was Oklahoma's longest-serving inmate on death row, having been incarcerated for nearly 40 years. On July 6, 1984, 7-year-old Layla Dawn Marie Cummings was abducted from her apartment in Elk City, Oklahoma, while her mother was at work. The perpetrator was Richard Norman Rojam Jr., who had recently divorced Layla's mother. Evidence suggested Rojam was aware of his ex-wife's work schedule and that the apartment door lock was broken. A beer cup with Rojam's fingerprint was found outside the apartment, and a condom wrapper near Layla's body was linked to a used condom found in Rojam's bedroom. The following morning, July 7th, a farmer discovered Layla's mutilated and partially clothed body in a field near Burns Flat. An autopsy revealed she died from multiple stab wounds, concentrated on her neck and vaginal area, and had been SA'd before her death. Prosecutors alleged that Rojam committed the crimes out of vengeance, possibly because Layla had reported he SA'd her, leading to his divorce and a parole violation. Rojam had previous convictions for SAing 2 teenage girls in Michigan in 1978. Richard Rojam Jr. was charged with kidnapping and first-degree murder. On June 1, 1985, a jury in Ouachita County District Court found him guilty on all counts after only 45 minutes of deliberation. The jury recommended 1,000-year sentences for kidnapping and the death penalty for murder. He was formally sentenced to death on July 11, 1985. Rojam's case was complex and involved numerous appeals over nearly 4 decades, resulting in him being sentenced to death 3 separate times. His first 2 death sentences were overturned by appellate courts due to jury errors and constitutional violations regarding jury instructions and the consideration of mitigating factors. A third jury resentenced him to death in 2007. Despite these reversals, he consistently lost subsequent appeals, including those to the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals and the U.S. Supreme Court, which ultimately upheld his third death sentence in 2010 and later refused to review it in 2017. Throughout these proceedings and up until his final moments, Rojam maintained his innocence in Layla's murder, though he acknowledged past wrongdoings. His attorneys argued that DNA evidence from Layla's fingernails did not link him to the crime and pushed for his sentence to be commuted to life without parole. However, the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board unanimously denied his clemency request in mid-June 2024. Richard Rojam Jr. was executed by lethal injection at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester on June 27, 2024, approximately 40 years after Layla Cummings' murder. When asked for his last words, Rojam, strapped to a gurney, stated, "I don't. I've said my goodbyes." The execution began at 10:03 a.m. His spiritual advisor was present. Layla's mother, Mindy Lynn Cummings, and other family members attended the execution, having waited decades for this final justice. Mindy Cummings issued a statement expressing that Rojam deserved nothing less than today's final justice for the savage, barbaric, and torturous acts of suffering he inflicted upon her daughter, adding, "Today, as we near the anniversary of Layla Dawn's horrific death on July 7th, we remember, honor, and hold her forever in our hearts as the sweet and precious 7-year-old she was." She also honored Layla's father, Don Cummings, who died by taking his own life shortly after Rojam's initial trial, attributing it to the absolute evil of a monster who purposely tormented him to the brink of despair that ended his life. Richard Rojam Jr. was pronounced dead at 10:16 a.m. Tavern Dave Hani was an American convicted murderer executed by lethal injection in Utah on August 8, 2024, for the 1998 murder of Claudia Ben. He was the first person executed in Utah in over 14 years. On July 9, 1998, Tavern Hani, then 22, brutally murdered his ex-girlfriend's mother, 49-year-old Claudia Ben. Hani had called his ex-girlfriend, Carol Pickyavitt, Ben's daughter and the mother of Hani's own child, demanding she visit him and threatening her family if she refused. When she went to work instead, Hani broke into Ben's house by shattering a sliding glass door. Ben attempted to defend herself with a kitchen knife, but Hani overpowered her, repeatedly slashing her throat and stabbing her in other parts of her body. The slashes to her throat were deep enough to reach her backbone. Ben's 3 young granddaughters, including Hani's 2-year-old daughter, were present in the house at the time of the murder and were found covered in blood. The judge who sentenced Hani to death also found that he had SA'd one of the children. When police arrived in response to a neighbor's 911 call, they found Ben's partially nude and mutilated body and apprehended Hani in the garage, covered in blood. He confessed, stating, "I stabbed her. I killed her with a knife." After his arrest, Hani was charged with aggravated murder, burglary, object, and forcible. He waived his right to a jury sentencing, opting for a bench trial. On May 20th, 1999, an Iron County court convicted him of aggravated murder and sentenced him to death by lethal injection. Over 2 decades, Hani pursued numerous appeals. A central point of his appeals concerned his waiver of jury sentencing, with claims that his attorney did not sufficiently explain this right or follow his instructions to retract the waiver. He also argued that his traumatic childhood on the Hopi Indian reservation, marked by parental alcohol abuse and neglect, along with his own substance abuse and a previous brain injury, should have been considered as mitigating factors. Hani, through his attorneys, expressed remorse and stated he would not have killed Ben if he had been in his right mind. However, both the Utah Supreme Court and the Utah Board of Pardons and Parole rejected his appeals and clemency petition, with the board stating they found no sufficient cause to commute Mr. Hani's death sentence. Ben's family members consistently advocated for his execution, with one niece stating, "He deserves an eye for an eye." Tavern Dave Hani was executed by lethal injection at the Utah State Correctional Facility in Salt Lake City in the early hours of August 8, 2024. For his last meal, he had a cheeseburger, French fries, and a milkshake. He spent the evening with his family, including his mother and daughter. In his final statement, Hani said, "From the start, it's been, if it needs to be done for the victims' families to heal, let's do this. If they tell you you can't change, don't listen to them. To all my brothers and sisters here, continue to change. I love you all. Take care." He also thanked the prison warden and director of prison operations for taking care of his family. At 12:04 a.m., a dose of pentobarbital was administered, followed by a second dose at 12:13 a.m. He flatlined at 12:21 a.m. His family was then permitted to enter the execution chamber to perform a spiritual ceremony over his body, after which he was officially pronounced dead at 12:25 a.m. His execution was Utah's first since 2010. Christopher Leroy Collings. The murder of Rowan Ford refers to the abduction and strangulation death of 9-year-old Rowan Demaya Ford in Stella, Missouri, on November 3, 2007. Rowan was reported missing by her mother, Colleen Munson, after she couldn't find her daughter in her bedroom. 6 days later, Rowan's body was discovered in a cave in a rural part of McDonald County, Missouri, nude from the waist down, with a ligature mark around her neck and injuries indicating she had been SA'd. An autopsy confirmed strangulation as the cause of death. 2 suspects were arrested. Rowan's 25-year-old stepfather, David Wesley Spears, and his friend, 32-year-old Christopher Leroy Collings. Collings, whom Rowan affectionately called Uncle Chris as he had lived with the family, confessed to abducting Rowan after heavy drinking her in his trailer and then strangling her with a rope from a pickup truck when she recognized him. Spears also confessed to his involvement in the crime and murder and admitted to helping Collings dispose of Rowan's body. Despite initially reporting Rowan missing and behaving suspiciously during the search, Spears later led authorities to where her body was found. In the legal proceedings, Christopher Collings was charged with first-degree murder, forcible SA, and statutory. He was convicted of first-degree murder in 2012 and sentenced to death. David Spears, Rowan's stepfather, pleaded guilty to lesser charges of child endangerment and hindering prosecution and was sentenced to 11 years in prison, from which he was later released. Collings pursued numerous appeals, including claims of intellectual disability and challenges to the reliability of key witnesses and DNA evidence, but his appeals were ultimately denied. Christopher Collings was executed by lethal injection on December 3, 2024, at the Eastern Reception Diagnostic and Correctional Center in Missouri. In his final statement, he apologized to those he had hurt, hoping they could find closure. The case had a profound impact on the community and investigators involved. Lauren Kensley Cole, born on November 11, 1966, in Iowa, experienced a difficult childhood marked by physical and emotional abuse and parental substance addiction. His parents, Don and Nicole, were reportedly alcoholics, and he was sent to foster care multiple times. At 17, in 1984, Cole was sent to the Arthur G. Dozier School for Boys, a now-closed Florida reform school notorious for severe abuse. During his 6-month stay, he claimed to have been regularly beaten by a guard and had both legs broken during an escape attempt. These traumatic experiences, particularly the alleged SA, became a significant part of his later appeals, with his legal team arguing that they contributed to his criminal behavior. While Cole would not have been eligible for recent state compensation programs for Dozier victims due to the dates of his attendance, his attorneys argued that the state's acknowledgement of abuse at the school should have influenced his sentencing. Prior to the 1994 murder of John Edwards, Cole had a history of 13 arrests and various offenses between 1985 and 1991, including theft and burglary. He was also wanted in Cincinnati on a counterfeiting charge. In 1991, he received a 5.5-year sentence for grand theft, but was controversially paroled after serving only 1 year, due to prison overcrowding and a low-risk assessment. This early release allowed him to commit the murder of John Edwards just 3 years later. During his nearly 3 decades on Florida's death row, Cole consistently maintained his innocence in John Edwards' murder, despite eyewitness testimony and forensic evidence linking him to the crime. He often pointed to his co-defendant, William Christopher Paul, as the killer. His appeals also highlighted his declining health, including a diagnosis of Parkinson's disease and arguments that his condition would make lethal injection an inhumane form of execution. Despite these efforts and pleas from his son and Catholic bishops, his appeals were exhausted. He was described as compliant in the hours leading up to his execution. On August 29, 2024, at Florida State Prison, after declining a last statement, Cole was executed by lethal injection. Media witnesses observed him taking deep breaths and his body trembling briefly before he ceased breathing. His execution marked the first in Florida in 2024 and the end of a 30-year legal battle. Willie James Pi was an American convicted murderer executed by lethal injection in Georgia on March 20, 2024, after nearly 30 years on death row. His case was notably contentious due to arguments regarding his intellectual disability and the alleged ineffective legal representation he received during his trial. On November 17, 1993, Willie James Pi, along with 2 accomplices, Chester Adams and Anthony Freeman, committed a series of violent crimes against his former girlfriend, Alicia Lynn Yarbrough, in Griffin, Georgia. Pi reportedly angered that another man had signed the birth certificate of a child he believed to be his, planned to rob Yarbrough's new boyfriend. The trio, armed and masked, broke into Yarbrough's home when she was alone with her baby. After stealing a ring and necklace, they abducted Yarbrough, leaving the infant behind. They drove her to a motel where all 3 men took turns essaying her at gunpoint. Following the essay, they drove Yarbrough to a remote dirt road where Pi ordered her to lie face down and shot her 3 times, killing her. Yarbrough's body was found hours later, and Pi and his accomplices were swiftly arrested. While Pi and Adams initially denied involvement, Freeman confessed and implicated the others, and DNA evidence later linked Pi to the crime. In February 1994, Pi was indicted on multiple charges, including malice murder, kidnapping with bodily injury, armed robbery, and burglary. His trial commenced in May 1996, and in June 1996 the jury found him guilty on all counts except felony murder and aggravated. For the malice murder charge, the jury recommended a death sentence, citing for statutory aggravating circumstances. The trial court then imposed the death penalty for the murder, along with 3 consecutive life sentences and 20 years for the other convictions. Pi's conviction and death sentence faced extensive appeals, primarily arguing that his trial counsel, Johnny Mosteller, was ineffective due to a lack of proper investigation and presentation of mitigating evidence. This evidence included details of Pi's traumatic childhood of extreme poverty, abuse, and neglect, as well as indications of intellectual disability, with an IQ of 68 and signs of frontal lobe brain damage. A 3-judge panel of the 11th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals initially vacated his death sentence in 2021, agreeing on the ineffective assistance of counsel. However, the full appeals court reversed this decision in 2022, reinstating the death sentence. The U.S. Supreme Court declined further appeals. Pi's legal team continued to seek clemency, citing his intellectual disability and the alleged inadequacy of his original defense, but the Georgia State Board of Pardons and Paroles denied his petition on March 19, 2024. On March 20th, 2024, Willie James Pi was executed by lethal injection at the Georgia Diagnostic and Classification Prison. This marked Georgia's first execution in over 4 years. On his final day, Pi received visits from family members, a clergy member, and his attorney. His last meal consisted of 2 chicken sandwiches, 2 cheeseburgers, French fries, 2 bags of plain potato chips, and 2 lemon lime sodas. Despite last-minute legal challenges and protests outside the prison, the execution proceeded. When offered the opportunity to make a final statement, Pi declined, but he did request a prayer from the attending clergy member. Witnesses reported that Pi remained mostly still as the sedative pentobarbital was administered, then exhaled rapidly several times before becoming still. He was pronounced dead at 11:03 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Brian Joseph Dorsey was an American convicted murderer executed by lethal injection in Missouri on April 9, 2024, for the 2006 murders of his cousin and her husband. On December 23, 2006, Brian Joseph Dorsey, then 34, called his cousin, 25-year-old Sarah and Bonnie, seeking money to pay off drug dealers who were threatening him. Sarah and her 28-year-old husband, Benjamin Wade Bonnie, allowed Dorsey to stay at their home in New Bloomfield, Missouri, to avoid the dealers. Later that night, while the Bonnies were asleep, Dorsey retrieved a single-shot shotgun from their garage. He entered their bedroom and fatally shot Sarah in the jaw, then reloaded the gun and shot Benjamin in the ear, killing him. After the murders, Dorsey SA'd Sarah's dead body, poured bleach on her lower body, and stole valuables from the house, including a cell phone, jewelry, firearms, and a DVD copy of Bambi 2, to repay his debts. The couple's 4-year-old daughter was left unharmed in the living room. The bodies were discovered the next afternoon by Sarah's parents when the Bonnies failed to show up for a family gathering. 3 days later, Dorsey surrendered to police and confessed to the murders. Brian Dorsey was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. On March 10, 2008, he pleaded guilty to the double murder. Despite his guilty plea, he still faced the possibility of a death sentence. In August 2008, a jury unanimously recommended 2 death sentences for each count of murder. On November 10, 2008, Circuit Judge Gene Hamilton formally sentenced Dorsey to death for both killings. Dorsey's subsequent appeals primarily focused on claims of ineffective legal counsel, arguing that his attorneys failed to adequately investigate and present evidence of his diminished mental capacity at the time of the crime due to heavy influence and withdrawal, as well as his good behavior as a model inmate during his 18 years on death row. He also raised doubts about DNA evidence. Both the Missouri Supreme Court and the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals rejected his appeals, with the latter citing that his claims of ineffective counsel were not sufficient to overturn his sentence. His final appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court was also rejected. A group of over 60 corrections officers and staff from the Missouri Department of Corrections, along with various advocates, petitioned Governor Mike Parson for clemency, requesting his sentence be commuted to life imprisonment without parole, but this was denied. Brian Dorsey was executed by lethal injection on April 9, 2024, at the Eastern Reception, Diagnostic and Correctional Center in Bonne Terre, Missouri. He had no special last meal request, and his spiritual advisor was present in the execution chamber. In his final written statement, Dorsey expressed profound remorse, stating, "To all of the family and loved ones I harmed, I am truly, deeply, overwhelmingly sorry. Words cannot hold the just weight of my guilt and shame." He was pronounced dead at 6:11 p.m. after a single dose of pentobarbital was administered. His execution marked Missouri's first in 2024 and occurred 18 years after the murders. Garcia Glenn White was executed by lethal injection in Texas on October 1, 2024, for the 1989 murders of twin 16-year-old sisters, Bennett and Annette Edwards. He was also the prime suspect in the murder of their mother, Benita Edwards, and 2 other women, though he was only convicted of the twins' murders. Born on February 4, 1963, in Houston, Texas, White had a promising early life, excelling in football and attending Lubbock Christian University. However, a knee injury ended his football career, leading him to drop out of college and fall into addiction, which reportedly escalated his violence. In the fall of 1989, White was involved in the beating death of 27-year-old Greta Williams, a prostitute, though he was not charged with this at the time. On November 30, 1989, White went to an apartment in Northeast Houston, a known crack house, occupied by Benita Edwards, a jobless widow, and her twin daughters, Bennett and Annette. White intended to use drugs and have sex with Bonita, but when she refused, he stabbed her multiple times. This commotion alerted her daughters. White then went to their bedroom, SA'd Annette, and then fatally stabbed her in the chest and slashed her throat. He proceeded to the bathroom and did the same to Burnett. After the killings, he partially covered Annette's body and gagged Burnett with a towel before fleeing. The bodies were discovered on December 2nd by Benita Edwards' concerned boyfriend. The murders remained a cold case for 6 years due to a lack of forced entry and initial leads. White was eventually linked to the Edwards murders after his arrest in connection with the July 1995 beating death of grocery store owner Hyvan Pham during a robbery. While being interrogated for Pham's murder, one of White's close friends informed police that White had confessed to killing the Edwards family. Confronted with this, White initially fabricated a story involving an accomplice, Terrence Moore, but later admitted he acted alone after being told Moore had died prior to the murders. DNA evidence, including semen on Bennett, matched White with a high probability. In May 1996, White was indicted for the murders of Bennett and Annette, with the SA aggravating the charges to potentially carry a death sentence. He was found guilty and sentenced to death 2 months later. White spent nearly 3 decades on death row, filing numerous unsuccessful appeals. His attorneys argued that he was intellectually disabled, which would make him ineligible for execution under Supreme Court rulings, and that he was suffering from a coke-induced psychotic break at the time of the murders. They also questioned the legitimacy of his videotaped confession and DNA evidence, alleging that samples from a blanket at the crime scene indicated another man was present. However, Texas courts repeatedly rejected these arguments, and the U.S. Supreme Court denied his last-minute appeals. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles also denied his request for clemency. On October 1, 2024, Garcia Glenn White, 61, was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit. In his final statement, he apologized for the pain he caused the Edwards family and anyone else, taking responsibility for his actions. He also sang verses from the hymn, I Trust in God, and urged his family and friends to just keep pushing forward, keep loving one another. He was pronounced dead 17 minutes after the lethal dose began flowing. His execution was the 6th in the U.S. within an 11-day period, a rare surge in capital punishment. Freddy Eugene Owens, also known by his adopted Muslim name Khalil Divine Black Son Allah, was an American man executed in South Carolina on September 20th, 2024, for the 1997 murder of convenience store clerk Irene Granger Graves. He became the first person executed in South Carolina in 13 years. Born on March 18, 1978, Owens had a deeply troubled childhood, reportedly experiencing severe physical abuse from his father, who would beat him and his siblings with bats, extension cords, and beer cans. His mother recalled an incident when he was a baby where his father shook and hit him until he wouldn't stop crying. These early traumas, combined with alleged brain damage from violence in a juvenile prison, were later raised by his defense as mitigating factors. On November 1, 1997, at the age of 19, Owens, along with co-defendant Stephen Golden, attempted to rob a Speedway convenience store in Greenville, South Carolina. During the robbery, Irene Graves, the 41-year-old single mother of 3 working at the store, was fatally shot in the head when she failed to open a safe. Golden, who testified against Owens, claimed Owens was the shooter. Owens was arrested on November 11, 1997. Surveillance footage showed 2 masked men, but it was not clear who fired the shot. No forensic evidence directly linked Owens to the shooting, and the murder weapon was never found. In February 1999, Owens stood trial for murder, armed robbery, criminal use of firearms, and conspiracy. Despite Golden's testimony, Owens maintained his innocence, claiming he was home in bed at the time. Golden, in exchange for his testimony, received a plea bargain, pleading guilty to voluntary manslaughter and serving 28 years in prison. Less than 12 hours after his conviction for Graves' murder, and before his sentencing, Owens brutally killed his cellmate, Christopher Brian Lee, at the Greenville County Jail. Owens confessed to the second murder in graphic detail, stating he did so because he was wrongly convicted of murder. This confession was repeatedly presented by prosecutors in subsequent sentencing hearings for Graves' murder. Owens' death sentence for Graves' murder was overturned and reimposed twice on appeal due to trial errors, including improper judicial comments regarding his right to a jury trial. His legal team consistently argued that his youth at the time of the crime, combined with his history of trauma and brain damage, diminished his culpability. They also highlighted the lack of direct forensic evidence, and in a last-minute effort, presented a sworn affidavit from Stephen Golden, recanting his trial testimony and claiming Owens was not present at the store. The South Carolina Supreme Court rejected this new affidavit, citing its inconsistency with Golden's previous statements and other witness testimony. Freddy Eugene Owens was executed by lethal injection at the Broad River Correctional Institute in Columbia, South Carolina, on September 20th, 2024. He declined to choose his method of execution, deferring to his attorney, who selected lethal injection. His last meal included 2 cheeseburgers, fries, a ribeye steak, wings, strawberry sodas, and apple pie. He was described as compliant in the hours leading up to his execution and briefly mouthed bye to his attorney. The execution took 19 minutes, with Owens appearing to mouth words and gasp before his breathing stopped. The state had resumed executions after a 13-year pause due to difficulties obtaining lethal injections, and this execution marked the first in South Carolina since 2011. Derek Ryan Dearman. The 2016 Citronelle homicides involved the brutal murder of 5 people, including a pregnant woman, on August 20th, 2016, in Citronelle, Alabama. The victims were Joseph Adam Turner, 26, his wife Shannon Melissa Randall, 35, Robert Lee Brown, 26, Justin Caleb Reed, 23, and Justin's wife Chelsea Marie Reed, 22, who was 5 months pregnant. All were relatives or connected to Lanita Lester, who had sought refuge at her brother Joseph Turner's home from her estranged boyfriend, Derek Ryan Dearman. In the early hours of August 20th, Dearman, after being repeatedly told to leave the property, returned and attacked the sleeping victims using an axe and a gun he found in the house. He then abducted Lester and a 3-month-old infant, taking them to his father's house in Mississippi, where Lester later escaped and reported the crime. Dearman subsequently turned himself in and confessed, initially blaming substance use. He was charged with 6 counts of capital murder, including the unborn child, and 2 counts of abduction. After pleading guilty, Dearman was still required to face a jury trial under Alabama law, which found him guilty and unanimously recommended the death penalty, a sentence affirmed by the court in October 2018. Despite arguments from his defense regarding his severe mental illness, Dearman ultimately dropped his appeals, stating his guilt and desire for justice for the victims' families. He was executed by lethal injection in Alabama on October 17, 2024, becoming the 5th person executed in the state that year. Kenneth Eugene Smith was an American convicted murderer whose execution by nitrogen hypoxia in Alabama on January 25, 2024, made history as the first time this method was used globally. Kenneth Eugene Smith was convicted for his involvement in the March 18, 1988, murder for hire of Elizabeth Dorling Sennett. Sennett's husband, Charles Sennett Sr., a debt-ridden minister, orchestrated the plot to collect insurance money. He hired Billy Gray Williams, who in turn recruited Smith and John Forrest Parker. On the day of the murder, Smith and Parker gained entry to the Sennett home. They brutally beat Elizabeth Sennett with a fireplace implement, a walking cane, and a piece of galvanized pipe, and then stabbed her multiple times, staging the scene to appear as a burglary. Charles Sennett Sr. took his own life a week later when investigators began to focus on him. John Forrest Parker was executed in 2010, and Billy Gray Williams died in prison in 2020. Smith was tried twice for the capital murder of Elizabeth Sennett. In his first trial in 1989, the jury found him guilty and recommended the death penalty by a 10-2 vote, which the judge accepted. However, this conviction and sentence were later vacated on appeal in 1992 due to procedural errors. In his second trial in 1996, the jury again found him guilty, but by an 11-1 vote, recommended a sentence of life imprisonment without parole. Despite this overwhelming jury recommendation, the trial judge overrode their decision and sentenced Smith to death. This practice of judicial override was later abolished in Alabama in 2017, but the change was not retroactive, meaning Smith remained on death row. Smith's execution journey was marked by a previous, aborted attempt by lethal injection in November 2022. On that occasion, execution staff were unable to establish an intravenous line after hours of attempts, leading to the execution being called off at the last minute. This left Smith with physical and psychological trauma. For his rescheduled execution on January 25, 2024, Alabama opted for nitrogen hypoxia, an unprecedented method. Smith spent his final hours meeting with family, friends, his spiritual advisor, and his attorney, and had a last meal of steak and eggs with hash browns. Despite last-minute appeals to the U.S. Supreme Court, which were denied, the execution proceeded. Smith was strapped to a gurney and a full-face respirator mask was placed over his face. At 7:57 p.m., pure nitrogen gas began to be administered. Witnesses reported that Smith appeared conscious for several minutes, shaking and writhing violently on the gurney for at least 2 to 4 minutes, and then took several minutes of heavy, gasping breaths before his breathing stopped. His spiritual advisor was seen repeatedly making the sign of the cross. Smith's last words were, "Tonight Alabama caused humanity to take a step backward. I'm leaving with love, peace, and light. Thank you for supporting me. Love all of you." He was pronounced dead at 8:25 p.m. Arthur Lee Burton, an American convicted murderer, was executed by lethal injection in Texas on August 7, 2024, for the 1997 murder of 48-year-old Nancy Adelman. On July 29, 1997, Nancy Adelman, a mother of 3, went for an evening jog near her Houston home and never returned. Her body was discovered the following day in a wooded area along Bray's Bayou. Investigators determined she had been beaten, essayed, and strangled to death with her own shoelaces. 10 days after the murder, 27-year-old Arthur Lee Burton was identified and brought in for questioning. After initial denials, Burton confessed to abducting and attempting to rape Adelman, stating he strangled her after she screamed and resisted, even as she reportedly asked if he knew God and forgave him. He later recanted this confession, claiming it was coerced and that he suffered from an intellectual disability. In October 1997, a Harris County jury indicted Arthur Lee Burton for capital murder. In June 1998, he was found guilty and the jury sentenced him to death. His death sentence was initially overturned by the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals in 2000, which granted him a new punishment trial. However, in 2002, a new jury again sentenced him to death. Arthur Lee Burton was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Huntsville, Texas, on August 7, 2024. Hours before the scheduled injection, the U.S. Supreme Court declined his final request for a stay based on his intellectual disability claims. In his final statement from the execution chamber, Burton thanked those who had supported him and expressed remorse, stating, "To all the people I have hurt and caused pain, I wish we didn't have to be here at this moment, but I want you to know that I am sorry for putting you all through this and my family." He concluded by saying, "Bird is going home." Adelman's widower, Mark Adelman, her son Jeffrey, and her brother Robert Bucoy witnessed the execution. Burton was pronounced dead at 6:47 p.m., concluding a 27-year legal process. A memorial to Nancy Adelman, including benches and etched bricks, stands near the spot where her body was found. Richard Bernard Moore was an American man executed in South Carolina by lethal injection on November 1, 2024, for the 1999 murder of convenience store clerk James Mahoney. Born on February 20, 1965, Moore grew up in Detroit, Michigan, and struggled with drug addiction, which led him to commit robberies. He had prior convictions for burglary and weapons charges in the 1980s. In 1991, he moved to Spartanburg, South Carolina, and later pleaded guilty to a battery of a high and aggravated nature for a separate attack in 1997. On September 16, 1999, Moore entered Nikki's convenience store in Spartanburg, unarmed, intending to rob it to support his coke addiction. Inside, he encountered the clerk, 42-year-old James Mahoney, and an eyewitness, Terry Haddon. A scuffle ensued between Moore and Mahoney after Mahoney drew a gun on Moore. Moore managed to wrestle one gun away, but Mahoney produced a second weapon. During the ensuing shootout, Moore was shot in the arm, and Mahoney was fatally shot in the chest. Moore then stole $1,408 from the store and fled. He was apprehended shortly after when his truck crashed into a telephone pole. Moore confessed to the crime at the scene. Moore was charged with armed robbery, a battery with intent to kill and murder. He was convicted in 2001, and the jury recommended the death penalty, which the trial judge imposed. Moore's case was particularly contentious because he entered the store unarmed, and his defense argued that the shooting occurred during a struggle where he was defending himself, rather than a premeditated act of murder. His legal team also raised concerns about racial bias, as Moore was black and the victim was white, and his was the last South Carolina death penalty case to be decided by an all-white jury. They argued that his death sentence was disproportionate compared to similar crimes. Over 2 decades, Moore pursued numerous appeals, consistently maintaining that he did not intend to kill Mahoney and that the shooting was a result of self-defense during the struggle. His case gained significant attention with a broad coalition including 3 jurors from his original trial, the trial judge, a former state prison director, his children, and pastors advocating for clemency. They argued that Moore was a changed man who had found God, overcome his addiction, and positively influenced others in prison. Despite the widespread appeals for mercy, South Carolina Governor Henry McMaster refused to grant clemency. Richard Bernard Moore was executed by lethal injection at the Broad River Correctional Institute in Columbia, South Carolina, on November 1, 2024. He was pronounced dead at 6:24 p.m. In his final statement, Moore apologized to James Mahoney's family for the pain and sorrow he caused, expressed love for his children and granddaughters, and offered prayers for prison staff and fellow inmates. He also sang several verses of the hymn, I Trust in God. Moore was the second inmate executed in South Carolina since the state resumed executions after a 13-year pause due to difficulties in procuring lethal injection drugs. Emmanuel Littlejohn was executed by lethal injection in Oklahoma on September 26, 2024, for his role in the 1992 murder of convenience store owner Kenneth Mears. On June 19, 1992, 31-year-old Kenneth Mears was fatally shot in the face during a robbery at his Root and Scoop convenience store in Oklahoma City. 2 men, 20-year-old Emmanuel Antonia Littlejohn and 25-year-old Glenroy Bethany, both of whom owed money to a drug dealer, perpetrated the robbery. Mears was shot with a single bullet. The crucial and highly controversial aspect of this case revolved around the identity of the shooter, as prosecutors presented conflicting theories in the separate trials of the 2 defendants. In Bethany's 1993 trial, the prosecutor argued that Bethany, who was taller and had darker skin, was the one who fired the shot, citing witness testimony from outside the store. Bethany was convicted of robbery with a firearm and first-degree murder and received a life sentence without parole. However, in Littlejohn's 1994 trial, the same prosecutor argued that Littlejohn was the shooter, stating that store employees testified Littlejohn was the only one with a gun. Littlejohn was convicted of first-degree malice aforethought murder, robbery, and attempted robbery. Littlejohn was sentenced to death for Mears' murder, along with 300 years for robbery and 99 years for attempted robbery. His death sentence was initially vacated in 1998 by the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals for resentencing, but a second jury again imposed the death penalty in 2000. For over 3 decades, Littlejohn appealed his sentence, consistently maintaining his innocence regarding the fatal shot, arguing that Bethany was the shooter. His legal team highlighted the inconsistent prosecutions, where the state presented contradictory theories about who pulled the trigger. They also argued that killings resulting from a robbery rarely warranted the death penalty in Oklahoma, and that if tried in a later era, Littlejohn would likely not have received the ultimate punishment, especially given the zealous prosecution style of former Oklahoma County District Attorney Bob Macy, who handled his case. Despite the conflicting evidence and the vigorous arguments from his defense team, Littlejohn's appeals were exhausted. In a significant development, the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board, by a 3-2 vote, recommended clemency for Littlejohn in August 2024, proposing his sentence be commuted to life in prison without parole. During his clemency hearing, Littlejohn apologized to Mears' family for his role in the robbery, but reiterated, "I didn't kill Mr. Mears." However, Oklahoma Governor Kevin Stitt rejected the board's recommendation, stating that a jury found Littlejohn guilty and he would not unilaterally overturn that decision. On September 26, 2024, Emmanuel Littlejohn, 52, received a lethal injection at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. His mother and daughter were present as witnesses. Little John spoke to them, asking his mother if she was okay and telling her he loved her. His mother, Celie Mason, sobbed quietly during the procedure. He was pronounced dead at 10:17 a.m. His execution marked the 1,600th execution in the United States since the reinstatement of capital punishment in 1976. Marcelus Williams was an American man convicted and executed in Missouri for the 1998 murder of Felicia Gale. On August 11, 1998, Felicia Gale, a 42-year-old former reporter for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, was found brutally murdered in her University City, Missouri home. She had been stabbed up to 43 times with a butcher's knife from her own kitchen, with one knife found lodged in her neck. Defensive wounds were noted on her hands and arms. Her purse, jacket, and her husband's Macintosh laptop computer were stolen during what appeared to be a burglary. The investigation initially struggled to find concrete links to a suspect. Forensic evidence collected at the scene, including shoe prints, fingerprints, and hairs, did not match Williams. Crucially, later DNA testing on the handle of the murder weapon in 2016 definitively excluded Marcelus Williams as the source of the male DNA. This DNA was later revealed to belong to a prosecutor who had handled the knife without gloves after it had been forensically tested. Despite the lack of matching physical evidence, Williams was convicted primarily based on the testimonies of two incentivized witnesses. Henry Cole, a former cellmate of Williams, and Laura Acero, Williams' then-girlfriend. Cole claimed Williams confessed to him while they were incarcerated, and reportedly received a $5,000 reward for his testimony. Acero also testified that Williams confessed to her that she saw on his shirt, scratches on his neck, and found Gale's identification in his car. A stolen laptop belonging to Gale's husband was also recovered from a man who testified Williams had sold it to him. Critics of the conviction, including the Midwest Innocence Project and the St. Louis County prosecuting attorney, later argued that these witnesses were unreliable and incentivized, and that their statements contained inconsistencies with crime scene evidence and their own prior accounts. Claims of racial bias in jury selection were also raised, noting that the jury was composed of 11 white individuals and only one black person, despite Williams being black and Gale being white. In August 2001, Marcelus Williams was convicted of first-degree murder, first-degree burglary, first-degree robbery, and armed criminal action, and was sentenced to death. His case endured a lengthy and contentious appeals process. In 2017, Governor Eric Greitens issued a last-minute stay of execution and established a board of inquiry composed of 5 retired federal judges to review new DNA evidence and other aspects of the case. However, in June 2023, Governor Mike Parson dissolved this board without receiving their report, lifting the stay on Williams' execution and stating it was time for the courts to proceed. In early 2024, St. Louis County prosecuting attorney Wesley Bell filed a motion to vacate Williams' death sentence, citing newly discovered DNA evidence, ineffective assistance of counsel, and alleged racial bias in jury selection. This was the first time a prosecutor in Missouri had used a new state law allowing intervention in cases of potential innocence. Despite these efforts and the reported support from Felicia Gale's family for a life sentence rather than execution, Governor Parson refused to intervene, stating that no court had found merit in Williams' innocence claims. Marcelus Williams was executed by lethal injection at the Eastern Reception, Diagnostic and Correctional Center in Bonne Terre, Missouri on September 24, 2024. Hours before the execution, the U.S. Supreme Court rejected his final appeal. Williams maintained his innocence until the end, with his attorney stating he never wavered in asserting his innocence of the crime for which he was put to death tonight. His final words were, "All praise to Allah in every situation." He was pronounced dead at 6 p.m., becoming the 100th person executed by Missouri since executions resumed in the state in 1989. Michael Dwayne Smith, known as the Hoover Killer, was an American convicted murderer executed by lethal injection in Oklahoma on April 4, 2024, becoming the state's first execution of the year. His crimes, committed on February 22, 2002, involved the separate murders of 41-year-old Janet Moore and 22-year-old Sarath Paluru in Oklahoma City. Smith, then 19 and a member of the Oak Grove Posse gang, first fatally shot Janet Moore in her apartment while looking for her son, whom he wrongly believed to be a police informant. He claimed she screamed, prompting him to shoot her. Later that day, he shot Sarath Paluru, a convenience store clerk, mistaking him for an individual who had allegedly disrespected his gang in a newspaper. After shooting Paluru multiple times, Smith doused his body and the store with lighter fluid, setting it on fire to destroy evidence. These acts occurred while Smith was already a fugitive, suspected in a separate 2001 shooting death. Smith was convicted and sentenced to death in 2003 for the murders of Moore and Paluru. Throughout his 21 years on death row, he consistently maintained his innocence, despite having confessed to the murders shortly after his arrest. His defense argued that his confession was made while he was high on PCP and that he suffered from an intellectual disability, which should have made him ineligible for the death penalty. They also highlighted alleged inconsistencies in his confession and issues with key witness testimony, including one witness who later expressed reluctance and admitted to not telling the full truth at trial. However, his appeals were repeatedly denied by the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals and the U.S. Supreme Court, and the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board denied his clemency request by a 4-1 vote, citing his multiple confessions and the corroborating evidence. On his last day, April 4, 2024, Smith declined a last meal and chose not to make a final statement in the execution chamber. He was executed by lethal injection at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. Witnesses reported that after the lethal drugs were administered, Smith briefly spoke to his spiritual advisor, expressing love to his family. He appeared to stare at the Attorney General, then began to snore audibly, with his breathing becoming progressively shallower before he became still. He was pronounced dead at 10:20 a.m., approximately 12 minutes after the process began. His execution, like others, reignited debates about capital punishment, the reliability of convictions, and the legal treatment of individuals with intellectual disabilities. Alan Eugene Miller was executed by nitrogen hypoxia in Alabama on September 26, 2024, becoming the second person in the United States and Alabama to be executed by this controversial method, following Kenneth Eugene Smith in January 2024. Miller was convicted of the August 1999 murders of 3 men in Pelham, Alabama. On August 5, 1999, Miller, who was employed as a delivery truck driver, used a .40 caliber Glock pistol to shoot and kill 2 of his coworkers, Lee Michael Holdbrooks, 32, and Christopher Scott Yancey, 28, at a heating and air conditioning distributor. Holdbrooks was shot 6 times and Yancey 3 times. Miller then drove 5 miles to a former workplace and shot and killed his previous supervisor, Terry Lee Jarvis, 39, with 5 shots. According to trial testimony, Miller's alleged motive for the murders was his belief that the men were spreading rumors about him being gay. After the shootings, Miller was spotted by police on an Alabama highway, and it took 4 officers and 4 sets of handcuffs to subdue him. In 2000, Miller was convicted of 3 counts of capital murder, the capital nature stemming from the murders being committed as part of one scheme or course of conduct. A jury recommended the death penalty by a 10-2 vote, which the trial court accepted. Miller's defense argued he suffered from severe mental illness, a claim supported by a psychiatrist they hired. His convictions and sentence were upheld on direct appeal and through state and federal collateral reviews. A significant aspect of Miller's case involved his method of execution. He was initially scheduled to be executed by lethal injection on September 22, 2022. However, this attempt was called off because prison staff failed to establish intravenous access after approximately 90 minutes and up to 18 needle pokes. Following this botched attempt, Miller filed a federal lawsuit. In November 2022, the state of Alabama agreed not to use lethal injection for his execution and instead would use nitrogen gas, a method Miller had claimed he elected when the state authorized it, though the state initially had no record of his choice. This agreement led to his being the second person in the U.S. to face execution by nitrogen hypoxia. On September 26, 2024, Alan Eugene Miller was executed by nitrogen hypoxia at Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, Alabama. He was pronounced dead at 6:38 p.m. local time. His last meal consisted of a hamburger steak, a baked potato, and French fries. His final words, muffled by the mask, were, "I didn't do anything to be in here. I didn't do anything to be on death row. Thank you." The execution was controversial. Witnesses reported that Miller visibly struggled for approximately 2 minutes, shaking and pulling at his restraints, followed by intermittent gasping for air for another 5 to 6 minutes before becoming still. His execution was the 1,600th in the United States since the resumption of capital punishment in 1977, and was the last of 5 executions carried out across the U.S. in a single week, the most in over 2 decades. Ivan Kentu was an American man convicted of capital murder and executed by lethal injection in Texas on February 28, 2024. He maintained his innocence until his death. On November 4, 2000, Ivan Kentu's cousin, 27-year-old James Mosqueda, and Mosqueda's 22-year-old girlfriend, Amy Kitchen, were found shot to death in their North Dallas home. Prosecutors argued that Kentu murdered them during an attempt to steal cash and drugs from Mosqueda, who was a dealer. Key evidence presented by the prosecution included jeans found in Kentu's trash, Kenneth's stolen Rolex watch, and the testimony of Kentu's then-fiancée, Amy Bircher, and her brother, Jeff Bircher. Amy Bircher testified that Kentu returned to their apartment with blood on his jeans after the murders and that she disposed of the clothing. She also claimed Kentu threw the stolen Rolex out of a car window. Jeff Bircher testified that Kentu told him about the murders in advance and later recruited him to help clean up. Kentu was found guilty of 2 counts of capital murder by a Collins County jury on October 16, 2001, and subsequently sentenced to death. Over the years, Kentu and his legal team filed numerous appeals, consistently maintaining his innocence and arguing that new evidence cast significant doubt on his conviction. A major development in his appeals was the recantation of testimony by key prosecution witnesses. Amy Bircher's brother, Jeff Bircher, recanted parts of his testimony in 2022 after Amy's death in 2021, stating he had lied and that his testimony was unreliable due to his substance use at the time and a desire to protect his sister. Additionally, new information emerged suggesting the Rolex watch, a key piece of evidence, was not actually stolen but recovered by police at the crime scene and returned to the victim's family, undermining Amy Bircher's testimony. A police officer also signed an affidavit stating she did not see bloody clothes in Kentu's trash during an initial wellness check. Despite these new revelations and calls from some original jurors and anti-death penalty advocates, including Sister Helen Prejean, for a new trial or a stay of execution, Texas courts repeatedly refused to consider the new evidence on its merits, citing procedural bars. Ivan Kentu was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Huntsville, Texas, on February 28, 2024. Leading up to his execution, there were widespread pleas for clemency from politicians, celebrities, and human rights organizations due to the doubts surrounding his conviction. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles denied his clemency request. In his final statement, Kentu continued to assert his innocence, addressing the victims' families. "I want you to know that I am an innocent man. I never killed James and Amy. If I did, I would have come forward with that information." He expressed sorrow for their loss and hoped his death would bring them peace. He chose not to have personal witnesses, but was joined by his spiritual advisor, Sister Helen Prejean, in the execution chamber. He was pronounced dead 21 minutes after the lethal dose of pentobarbital was administered. His execution was the first in Texas in 2024 and further fueled the ongoing debate about wrongful convictions and the death penalty in the United States. Joseph Edward Corcoran was an American convicted mass murderer executed by lethal injection in Indiana on December 18, 2024, for the 1997 murders of 4 individuals, including his brother and sister's fiancé. Born on April 18, 1975, Corcoran grew up in Hamilton, Indiana. Prior to the 1997 murders, at nearly 17 years old, he was accused of murdering his parents, Jack and Catherine Corcoran, in their Steuben County home in April 1992. Evidence suggested he used a 12-gauge shotgun, possibly due to resentment over strict parenting, a car he believed was his, and his music tapes being burned. Despite friends testifying that he had offered the money and a shotgun to kill his parents, the evidence was circumstantial, and he was acquitted after a 5-day trial. The case remains unsolved. After his acquittal, Corcoran never completed high school and worked various menial jobs. By age 22, he had accumulated a collection of 32 firearms. On July 26, 1997, in Fort Wayne, Indiana, Corcoran fatally shot 4 men: his 30-year-old brother James Corcoran, his 32-year-old sister's fiancé, Robert Scott Turner, and 2 friends, 30-year-old Timothy G. Bricker and 30-year-old Douglas A. Stillwell. The motive for these killings was attributed to stress over his sister's upcoming marriage, which would necessitate him moving out of their shared home. Prosecutors stated that he believed the men were talking about his suspected involvement in his parents' deaths. His then 7-year-old niece was also present in the home, but was unharmed. Corcoran was convicted in 1999, and a jury unanimously recommended the death penalty, which the Allen Superior Court imposed based on the aggravating circumstance of multiple murders. Throughout his lengthy appeals process, Corcoran's mental health was a central issue. He was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, displaying symptoms like hallucinations and delusions, and his attorneys argued that his mental illness prevented him from rationally understanding his situation or assisting in his defense. Despite repeated attempts by his legal team to halt his execution and seek a reassessment of his mental competency, state and federal courts, including the Indiana Supreme Court and the U.S. Supreme Court, consistently denied these appeals. Corcoran himself, at one point, expressed a desire to waive further appeals, stating in an affidavit that he was guilty of the crime I was convicted of and accepted the appellate court's findings. On December 18, 2024, Joseph Corcoran, 49, was executed by lethal injection at the Indiana State Prison in Michigan City, marking Indiana's first execution in 15 years. His last meal request was Ben and Jerry's ice cream. His final words were reportedly, "Not really. Let's get this over with." His childhood pastor was present in the execution chamber. Corcoran's sister, Kelly Ernst, whose fiancé was one of the victims, expressed a belief that the death penalty should be abolished and voiced her distress over the timing of the execution so close to Christmas. David Russell Hoer was an American ex-soldier convicted of murder and executed by lethal injection in Missouri on June 11, 2024. He maintained his innocence throughout the legal process. On September 28, 2009, in Jefferson City, Missouri, 54-year-old David Hoer broke into the apartment of his ex-lover, 45-year-old Angela Yvonne Gilpin, and her husband, 61-year-old Rodney Dean Gilpin. Hoer fatally shot both of them. Prosecutors argued that Hoer committed the murders out of anger and jealousy. Hoer and Angela Gilpin had been involved in a long-term affair, but Angela had recently reconciled with Rodney in August 2009, ending her relationship with Hoer. Court documents and evidence suggested that Angela had feared Hoer, as an application for a protective order against him, and a statement expressing her fear that he might shoot her and Rodney were found in her purse after her death. In the days leading up to the murders, Hoer had reportedly made comments threatening Angela. Following the killings, Hoer fled to Oklahoma, where he was apprehended after a police chase. In his vehicle, authorities found 15 firearms, a bulletproof vest, numerous forms of ammunition, and other weapons, including a Sten submachine gun, which investigators believed to be the murder weapon, though ballistics tests were inconclusive. David Hoer was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, armed criminal action, first-degree burglary, and unlawful possession of a firearm by a felon. He pleaded not guilty on January 20th, 2010. On October 23rd, 2013, after less than 2 hours of deliberation, a jury found Hoer guilty of first-degree murder in Angela Gilpin's death, along with the other charges. 2 days later, the jury unanimously recommended a death sentence for Hoer for Angela's murder. The trial court sentenced him to death and imposed additional prison sentences for the other convictions. Hoer's subsequent appeals primarily focused on circumstantial evidence, the alleged lack of physical evidence linking him directly to the crime scene, no confession, eyewitnesses, fingerprints, or DNA at the scene, and claims of ineffective legal counsel. His attorneys argued that the ballistics evidence was inconclusive and that evidence of his traumatic upbringing, including the murder of his police officer father when Hoer was 16, and a stroke he suffered in 2007, which they claimed caused brain damage, should have been more thoroughly presented as mitigating factors. They also contended that the trial judge had a conflict of interest. However, the Missouri Supreme Court and the 8th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals rejected his appeals. His final appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court was denied in August 2023. Missouri Governor Mike Parson denied his clemency petition just days before his execution, stating that Hoer displays no remorse for his senseless violence and had a decades-long history of violence against women. David Hoer was executed by lethal injection at the Eastern Reception, Diagnostic and Correctional Center in Bonne Terre, Missouri, on June 11, 2024. Despite his continued claims of innocence, his final appeals for a stay of execution were denied. For his last meal, he requested a New York strip steak, a baked potato with butter and sour cream, Texas toast, a Dutch apple pie, orange juice, and milk. In a final statement released before the execution, Hoer wrote, "I'm the luckiest man on earth. I've been able to speak the truth of my innocence. I leave you all with love. Now I get to go to heaven. Don't cry for me. Just join me when your time comes." He was pronounced dead at 6:11 p.m. after receiving a single dose of pentobarbital. His execution was Missouri's second of 2024. Keith Edmund Gavin. On March 6, 1998, in Center, Alabama, 68-year-old William Clinton Clayton Jr., a contract courier and devoted father of 7, was fatally shot during a robbery by Keith Edmund Gavin. Clayton had stopped at an ATM at Regions Bank to withdraw money to take his wife out to dinner when Gavin, who was accompanied by his cousin Dwayne Lemark Meeks, approached his work van. Gavin, armed with a .40 caliber Glock pistol, opened the van door and fired 2 shots at Clayton, pushing him into the passenger seat before taking the wheel and driving away. Meeks, who witnessed the shooting, fled the scene. A police investigator spotted the stolen van and pursued, leading to Gavin stopping the vehicle, firing at the officer, who was unharmed, and fleeing into nearby woods. Clayton was found barely alive in the van with 3 gunshot wounds and was pronounced dead at a local hospital. A manhunt ensued, and Gavin, who had been on parole after serving 16 years for a 1982 murder in Illinois, was found hiding in a creek and apprehended. Gavin was charged with capital murder during a robbery and attempted murder of a law enforcement officer. In November 1999, a jury recommended a death sentence by a 10-2 vote for Clayton's murder. On January 5, 2000, Circuit Judge David A. Raines formally sentenced Gavin to death for William Clayton Jr.'s murder and life imprisonment for the attempted murder. Throughout his appeals, Gavin maintained his innocence, claiming his cousin, Dwayne Meeks, against whom the murder charge was later dropped, was the real killer and that his trial counsel was ineffective for failing to present evidence of his abusive childhood. However, his numerous appeals to the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals, the Alabama Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court were all rejected, with higher courts ultimately upholding his death sentence. After 25 years on death row, Keith Edmund Gavin was executed by lethal injection at Holman Correctional Facility in Alabama on July 18, 2024. On his final day, he refused breakfast and his last meal but ate lunch and some snacks. He received visitors, including family members and his attorney. Gavin had filed a lawsuit to prevent an autopsy on his body, citing his Muslim faith, which was granted by the court. During the execution, Gavin made no special last statement but had given a thumbs up to family members in the witness room, saying, "I love my family. I love my brother and sister. I couldn't ask for more. Charlotte, his attorney, you fought hard for me. I love y'all. Carry on." He was pronounced dead at 6:32 p.m., marking Alabama's third execution of 2024. Ramiro Felix Gonzalez, an American convicted murderer, was executed by lethal injection in Texas on June 26, 2024, for the 2001 murder of 18-year-old Bridget Faye Townsend. His execution occurred on what would have been Townsend's 42nd birthday. On January 15, 2001, Bridget Faye Townsend disappeared from her boyfriend Joe Leal's home in Bandera County, Texas. 18-year-old Ramiro Felix Gonzalez intruded the home with the intention of stealing coke. Finding Townsend alone, he overpowered and tied her up, stealing cash but finding no drugs. He then forced Townsend into his truck and drove her to his grandfather's ranch in neighboring Medina County. Despite her pleas for mercy, Gonzalez SA'd her before fatally shooting her with a hunting rifle. He then abandoned her body in a field in southwest Texas. Townsend's remains were not discovered until October 2002, when Gonzalez, already serving 2 consecutive life sentences for an unrelated abduction case from September 2001, confessed to her murder and led authorities to her body. Ramiro Felix Gonzalez was charged with capital murder for Bridget Townsend's death. In August 2006, he was found guilty by a Medina County jury, which unanimously sentenced him to death. Throughout his appeals, Gonzalez's legal team raised several arguments, including that he suffered from brain damage due to his mother's substance use during pregnancy and that he had been a victim of SA himself in childhood. A key point of contention in his appeals was the recanted testimony of a prosecution expert witness, psychiatrist Edward Gripon, who had originally testified that Gonzalez would pose a future danger to society, a necessary legal finding for a death sentence in Texas. Dr. Gripon later re-evaluated Gonzalez and stated his earlier prediction was incorrect, noting Gonzalez's rehabilitation and good conduct in prison. Despite these arguments and a clemency plea highlighting his remorse and faith-based transformation in prison, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals and the U.S. Supreme Court denied his appeals. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles also unanimously rejected his clemency request. Ramiro Felix Gonzalez was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Huntsville, Texas, on June 26, 2024. He offered a final statement to the victim's family, saying, "I can't put into words the pain I have caused y'all, the hurt, what I took away that I cannot give back. I hope this apology is enough." He added that he had never stopped praying that you would forgive me, and hoped, "One day you will forgive me." As the single dose of pentobarbital was administered, he took 7 breaths and made snoring sounds before becoming still. He was pronounced dead at 6:50 p.m. The execution marked the second in Texas for 2024 and occurred on what would have been Bridget Townsend's 42nd birthday, a detail her mother noted as providing a measure of comfort and closure. Carrie Dale Grayson. The murder of Vicki W. occurred between February 21st and 22nd, 1994, in Jefferson County, Alabama, when 37-year-old Vicki W. was kidnapped, tortured, and murdered while hitchhiking from Tennessee to her mother's home in Louisiana. She was picked up by 4 youths. 19-year-old Carrie Dale Grayson, along with Kenneth Loggins, Trace Duncan, both 17, and Louis Mangione, 16. The group, who had been drinking and using drugs, deviated from her intended route, taking her to a wooded area where they brutally attacking her by kicking her repeatedly. When she was still alive, Grayson and Loggins stood on her throat, causing her to gurgle and die. The perpetrators then took her body and luggage to Bald Rock Mountain, where they SA'd her corpse, stole her ring and clothes, and threw her body off a cliff. The trio, excluding Mangione, who was dropped off, later returned to mutilate her body further, stabbing and cutting the corpse 180 times and amputating her fingers and thumbs. W's badly shattered body was discovered by rock climbers on February 26, 1994, and investigators identified the teens after one boasted about the murder and displayed a severed finger. All 4 were arrested and charged. Louis Mangione received a life sentence. Kenneth Loggins and Trace Duncan were initially sentenced to death, but had their sentences commuted to life imprisonment in 2006 after the U.S. Supreme Court banned the execution of individuals under 18 at the time of their crimes. Carrie Dale Grayson, the only one over 18, remained on death row and was executed by nitrogen hypoxia in Alabama on November 21, 2024, becoming the 3rd person in the U.S. to die by this method. His execution was controversial, with his lawyers arguing it caused conscious suffocation and the victim's daughter speaking out against capital punishment despite her loss. Jamie Ray Mills was an American convicted murderer executed by lethal injection in Alabama on May 30th, 2024, for the 2004 murders of Floyd and Vera Hill. His common-law wife, Joan Mills, was also convicted in connection with the crime. On June 24th, 2004, 87-year-old Floyd Hill and his 72-year-old wife Vera Hill were brutally attacked in their home in Gwynn, Alabama. Jamie Ray Mills, a 30-year-old neighbor, accompanied by his wife Joan Mills, approached the elderly couple after an overnight methamphetamine session. Jamie Mills asked to borrow their phone, gaining entry to their home. Once inside, Jamie Mills viciously bludgeoned Floyd Hill with a machete, tire tool, and ball-peen hammer while he was in the shed. Hearing the attack, Vera Hill turned back to the shed and was also severely beaten. After the attack, Jamie and Joan Mills ransacked the house, stealing prescriptions and $140. Floyd Hill died at the scene from his injuries, while Vera Hill, though gravely wounded, survived until September 12, 2004, succumbing to complications from blunt head trauma. The couple's children and grandchildren alerted police after being unable to reach them by phone, leading to the discovery of their bodies in a padlocked shed. The murder weapons, along with bloody clothing and the Hill's DNA, were later found in Jamie Mills' car. Jamie Ray Mills and Joan Mills were arrested the day after the murders and tried separately. In August 2007, a jury in an Alabama state court found Jamie Mills guilty of 2 counts of capital murder. The jury, by an 11-1 majority, recommended the death penalty, which the trial judge imposed in November 2008. It was later revealed that Joan Mills, who initially faced the same capital murder charges, agreed to a plea bargain. She pleaded guilty to lesser murder charges and testified against her husband in exchange for a life sentence with the possibility of parole. Her earliest parole hearing is set for December 2027. A third suspect, local dealer Benji Howe, against whom charges were dropped. Jamie Mills repeatedly appealed his death sentence to state and federal courts, maintaining his innocence and arguing that his wife's plea deal incentivized her to lie, thus corrupting her testimony. However, all of his appeals were ultimately rejected as untimely or lacking sufficient evidence to overturn the conviction. Jamie Ray Mills was executed by lethal injection at Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, Alabama, on May 30th, 2024. He spent his final 24 hours engaging in visits and phone calls with friends, family members, his attorney, and his spiritual advisor. He had no special last meal request. As the execution began, Mills gave a thumbs-up gesture towards his family members in the witness room and stated, "I love my family. I love my brother and sister. I couldn't ask for more. Charlotte, his attorney, you fought hard for me. I love y'all. Carry on." As the first sedative drug was administered, Mills appeared to quickly lose consciousness while his spiritual advisor prayed. He was pronounced dead at 6:26 p.m., concluding a nearly 20-year wait for justice for the victim's family, who issued a statement saying, "Justice has been served." His execution was the first in Alabama via lethal injection since the state performed the nation's first nitrogen gas execution earlier in the year.